Good evening. Eid Mubarak to anyone celebrating today, and welcome to Lessons from Community Media, jointly organised by the Media Reform Coalition and Soundart Radio. I'm Debs Grayson, I'm your chair today, and I'm the coordinator for a campaign called The BBC and Beyond, Reimagining Public Media. This is a new campaign from the Media Reform Coalition to try and reimagine what public media could or should be in the digital age. Today's event is one of a series which will be feeding into a manifesto for a people's media we'll be writing later this year. Tomorrow evening, we'll be holding another event on protest, dissent and the media as part of the Writing on the Wall Festival, and there will be more events coming up in June. You can find details on our website and social media, and recordings of previous events are available on the Media Reform Coalition YouTube. I'm just going to open by saying a bit about the BBC and Beyond campaign. This is a campaign about public media. What we mean by public media are media institutions that act in the public interest rather than the interests of politicians, wealthy owners, or big businesses. In some ways, it's an aspiration. We think that public media should be independent, able to hold powerful interests to account. They should be accountable, facing consequences when they do harm. They should be democratic, participatory, and representative of diverse lives. And they should be for everyone, serving everybody's needs and accessible to all. We all know that most of the media we have today are very far from this ideal. In theory, these principles of independence, accountability, and universality underpin our public broadcasters, the BBC and Channel 4. I'm sure part of the discussion today will cover how well we think they live these out in practice and how they could be changed to do better. But this is a campaign which is also about thinking beyond the BBC, and our definition of public media is deliberately broad enough to include smaller independent media outlets, which are often the ones that most closely live out ideals of acting in the public interest. This kind of independent media has flourished in recent years, but often struggles to sustain itself. Our manifesto will also include ideas for how to support these kinds of initiatives. If you have ideas you'd like to see included in our manifesto for a people's media, you can write them in the chat on whatever platform you're watching, and also contribute via the BBC and Beyond website. There should be a link in the chat where you're watching. Today's event is about community media. There are 300 community radio stations and 20 local television stations operating across the UK. Most of them are run on a shoestring by volunteers and are often overwhelmed by commercial competitors and larger institutions like the BBC. But at their best, community media projects are the most participatory and inclusive kinds of media that we have. Today, we'll be looking at the future of community media in turbulent times and trying to draw out some of the most important lessons we can take from the sector of how we really build the accountable, independent, democratic, and universal media that we all need. To explore these questions, we have a fantastic panel of speakers. Each of them is going to speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will all come together for a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please add it in the comment stream on the platform you're watching on, and we'll take as many in the time that we have. Our speakers today are Caroline Mitchell. Caroline is Associate Professor of Radio and Participation at the University of Sunderland and has been involved in community radio production, activism and research since 1980. She was the co-founder of FM, the first women's radio station in the UK, and was part of the Transnational Radio Encounters project, whose research led to the amazing Radio.Garden platform. She is currently developing research about youth-led digital, cultural and media spaces to further voice and action around the themes of identity and integration. Then we'll have Lucinda Guy. Lucinda is a sound and radio artist working in community contexts. She is a founder and director of 2 full-time FM radio stations, Soundart Radio, which engages over 100 people in creative radio making in the Totnes area of South Devon, and Skylark, which is a fully automated station for Dartmoor that broadcasts a single, continuous and evolving sound collage. She's a researcher with Transtechnology Research at the University of Plymouth, looking at how radio art practices, studio designs and automation technologies can inform community radio and further its purpose of increasing voice. And finally, we have Shamiza Rashid. Shamiza is an award-winning community broadcaster, theatre maker, creative producer and artivist. She presents on Inspire FM based in Luton and Radio Lab 97.1 FM, the University of Bedfordshire's official community radio station. So now I'll hand over to Caroline.
Thanks very much. So I think it may be useful to start with a sort of partial and brief contextual timeline of how the current community radio sector was established. So here goes my speed history. The 1970s, community radio is alive and well and a third force in most countries and continents, apart from the United Kingdom. The new sector of commercial radio has a limited public service remit, and as we now know, the BBC was pretty much staffed by people who came out of the public school system and Oxbridge, and for many people who did get to work there, it was a pretty toxic and oppressive working culture, particularly if you're from a female or from a minoritized ethnic group. In terms of programming, the BBC offered token time to minoritized groups, usually on an unpaid basis and in the middle of the night. Moved to the 1980s. I was part of an independent co-op called Local Radio Workshop, and there we and other member groups carried out research in London to see how local radio covered minority content. We slated Capital Radio, BBC Radio London and LBC, Local Radio Workshop, and then the newly formed Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom made a case for local radio reform. And they were against setting up community radio. But pirates, both commercial and grassroots, had other ideas. And there was also a well-organized lobby and movement of interest groups for local and community of interest stations to establish a legal third sector of community radio. Move forward to the 1990s. Experimental and temporary community radio stations were allowed to broadcast with short-term licenses. The many experiments were popular and proved that there was a demand, expertise, and audience interest. Many of the first experimental stations, though, were taken over by commercial companies when they failed to thrive due to lack of funding and protection from takeover. An evaluation by Anthony Everett recommended a sector to go ahead, and there should be government funding for station admin support and training. So from 2000, we saw the long, slow pathway to legislation for a separate sector. The main principles were that the stations should be non-profit distributing, democratically owned and required. There was a requirement for right to access and training, and very importantly, protection from takeover by commercial stations. We saw the development of a number of models of local, hyperlocal, and community of interest stations, including minority language, ethnic and faith stations. So move forward 2010 to 20, the sector grows, and now, as Deb said, there are over 300 stations operating with community radio licenses awarded by Ofcom. The sector has more stations than commercial radio and BBC put together. As people have migrated away from FM radios to digital platforms, we've seen community stations use a number of different platforms to reach audiences. As the platform Radio Garden demonstrates, there are thousands of community stations worldwide existing as a third sector alongside public and commercial stations. By 2021, we see that audio streaming and podcasting are enabling people to produce content in new spaces, and community stations, ever resilient, are also using these platforms. However, community radio is in danger of losing its protected characteristics as it migrates to digital audio broadcasting, DAB, alongside commercial radio channels. So now I'd like to look at two areas in order to raise some questions about what public service broadcasting can learn from community radio and how this third force needs to be supported and sustained. First, I'll look at the distinctiveness of the community radio sector in terms of its ethos and funding. And second, the diversity of the sector in terms of participation and content. And finally, I'll conclude with some comments and questions about the sustainability of the sector and the threats and opportunities over the next decade, including how the sector relates to the BBC. So distinctiveness, and we've seen this year, like all radio services, community stations have adapted themselves in new ways over the past year's pandemic to serve their audiences. The member organisation Community Media Association secured £400,000 in funding to help sustain stations during the pandemic. And in a recent radio studies and local and community broadcasting seminar, We heard from Spice FM in Newcastle that they were the main organisation communicating information for Asian businesses during the pandemic. South Asian audiences were not getting the information from the council or BBC about support for individuals and businesses. Spice FM was translating and communicating what they could find about government schemes themselves. In East Leeds, Chapel FM was a station that was specially licensed to communicate with people who had no internet, older audiences mainly. By coincidence or not, BBC Local Radio set up a number of short-term hyperlocal stations during the pandemic to reach more localized audiences. In many ways, appropriating community radio approaches, such as having hyperlocal branding and presenters from the area whose accents were relatable to audiences that the BBC have avoided or ignored in the past. Joe Coleman's very recent research about community radio in the pandemic has found that community radio stations are important anchors for their members and audiences to combat isolation and convey specialist news and information. She suggests, and I quote, "The community sector seems to be gaining ground in becoming the nation's trusted local radio provider." In 2015, BBC controller of BBC English Regions and the chair of the Community Media Association signed an agreement to pledge a closer working relationship to help deliver on the public service objectives of both organisations. This has included occasional series of highlights of community stations broadcast in the wee hours on the BBC and a BBC Community Media Reporters Day. But community stations' experiences of the quality of this relationship has been really variable. There's no consistency of approach and no funded post to make sure that this is part of a real plan to value the contributions and experiences of community contributors. Funding is a huge headache for community media projects. The sector is supported by two government funds. The Community Radio Fund has been running since 2005. It started with a budget of £500,000 a year to be distributed amongst 14 community radio broadcasts, 1-4. But since then, the fund has had to support an increased number of up to 300 community stations and an estimated 25,000 volunteers with the same budget. There's not enough to go around. Since 2019, the Audio Content Fund has funded around £1 million a year for independent producers to make public service content for UK and commercial and community radio. This has brought funding for independent producers, great, to develop new content, great, although funds cannot go into the community radio stations themselves to fund the process of production. This painstaking longer-term work by people in community stations who really know their communities, characterised by training and community development methods. If this fund continues past its 3-year initial phase, there needs to be a change here. By far, the majority of funding comes from volunteer labour, local fundraising, some limited advertising revenue, diminishing service level agreements from councils and statutory services, and many, many creative partnerships to leave a lottery and charitable foundation projects that bring in community media as a tool for social change. The sector needs far more support from central or devolved funding, and persuading successive governments that community media is an effective use of funds has been long, slow work. The diversity of the sector. The sector of over 300 stations make it the biggest sector in the UK. It comprises stations and projects that now have decades of experience and have built up communities of presenters and programme makers who are embedded in a very wide range of voluntary and community organisations. In my experience, community radio has been doing diversity more successfully than BBC local or national radio over the years. It's developed new audiences through specialist programming and put the time in to train and develop numerous reporters and programme makers from diverse backgrounds. This group of community change makers and creative media workers has become a core part of resistance and expression in their localities and community of interest. There are so many to mention, but I'll give a few examples. Desi Radio, a Punjabi culture and language station in Southall, which has enabled women from that community to have a real media voice. Ujima Radio in Bristol, which has the local mayor and representatives of Black community and cultural organisations on daily. Sound Communities in Torbay works with children and young people in a way that the BBC just doesn't prioritise. Resonance FM, the experimental station in London, sustains a rich audio diet of experimental arts, music and programming. Bradford Community Broadcasting has for years represented the diversity of Bradford's communities. This morning, I counted up to 103 presenters on their website, all volunteers, but this organisation still needs funding to support and coordinate this amazing human broadcasting effort. There are also new independent networks developing which support specialist work in community media, including the recently formed Later Life Audio and Radio Cooperative. So community media has proved to be valuable training ground for new entrants to the media. Many of the participatory programming and partnership working strategies pioneered by community radio have been cherry-picked for BBC programming for one-off series, and then the people and programmes have been dropped for the next new programme idea or institutional priority. Diversity schemes have taken up a great deal of time, money and rhetoric at the BBC, promising much, arguably delivering little. People who want to get broadcasting experience spend a lot of time in community media, and this is valued up to a point, but not funded by the BBC or commercial radio. So there's a real danger that there will be a corporate media grab of not just local radio, but community radio as it migrates to mixed commercial and community on local DAB platforms. And to end with, I'd like to borrow an analogy from Rob Watson's excellent Decentered Media podcast and blog. He draws parallels with community media with a recent attempted takeover of local football by the English Super League. Now, whether you are interested in football or not, it was impossible to ignore the huge loyalty and concern from local fans about this attempted coup. And I quote from Rob's blog, Ofcom and DCMS seem to have done little to investigate and examine the impact that media consolidation has been having on our local life. Research about the loss of media at local and neighbourhood level is seldom included in governmental discussions about sustainability and social adaptation to change. While being in the same ministry, the Office for Civic Society doesn't even talk to the teams of the in the media departments. Surely it is time to look at how our local communities at the parish, village, neighbourhood, town and city levels are served by dedicated and accessible media outlets that are open and accountable to the residents of the place that they represent and serve. We have, so I'm coming out of the quote now, we have a community sector rich in experience and impact, but it's poorly protected from the ravages of anti-competitive practices. Community broadcasting exists in a public service arena with the BBC, where despite some progressive initiatives and potential alliances, it is still patronised, thrown the odd bit of airtime or training, and thrown away when the BBC has had its fill. Community broadcasting and independent media deserve to thrive in conditions that are nurturing, supportive, and properly funded. The existing community access and production funds need to be expanded to meet the interests and concerns of people who are often the most digitally, socially, economically, and culturally disadvantaged, especially by the current political administration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Caroline. That was a really comprehensive intro for anyone that is not so familiar with what community media is. And I think, you know, one of the things that's very interesting to me is really showing how community media has been flourishing in the last 10 years at a time when commercial newspapers, local commercial newspapers have been closing in their droves. So I think there's something there as well that's really important about this space of publicly funded non-commercial media and it actually being a, you know, if we can create the funding models to properly sustain that, it is actually a more viable model than the kind of commercial models that which we've had before. Lucinda, let's hear from you.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much, Debs. Thank you, Caroline. Brilliant as always. I think some of the things I'm saying might feel like we're reiterating a bit, but that's probably important too. So, as we've been hearing, there's currently over 300 full-time community radio stations licensed to broadcast on FM or AM frequencies around the UK, and all of these have emerged within the last 2 decades. So though it's well established here now, we were quite late to the party, as Caroline was saying. Community radio has been a global movement since the early days of radio, For example, some of the community stations in Canada now celebrating their 100th anniversaries. But there isn't one simple legal definition of what community media is. Instead, there's a complex, living, diverse culture of small studios which are run by resourceful volunteers, students, working people, largely without media training or without a professional media background, who want to come together to make their own media, to play around with the stuff of radio and have long, unfiltered conversations interrupted by the demands of play-out systems, ads, news and weather, and to report immediately from situations that affect their lives, to make their own music and dramas and to tell their own stories. Some of these are licensed broadcasters, some of these are pirates, and some are in between, as in some cities, certain low-powered transmission to your own neighbours doesn't always need a license. In these free radio spaces, airtime is abundant. We don't reduce our guests to sound bites or cliches, and there's time for artists to create work that redefines what radio can be and subverts traditional media power relationships. If you set foot in a community radio station anywhere in the world, you might find you're immediately invited to go on air and have a chat with someone. And in the next room, there'll be people deep in conversation on old shabby sofas, talking about music, politics, their journey in there today, and sharing some cake and coffee. Here at Soundart Radio, we say we're a space to listen, play, and experiment. And it's this informal, long-term kind of culture where people from towns or neighbourhoods come together to create their own media that was celebrated by the campaigners and the researchers in the UK who helped to define the parameters of community radio that was written into the Community Radio Order of 2004, ensuring a space in broadcast media where people can have a voice at all levels, easily moving between roles of listener, presenter, producer, or owner. So here's a description taken from the Ofcom website. They say, a community radio station's programmes will reflect the needs and interests of its audience, but rather than talk at its community, the station should become a central part of it. This means creating direct links with its listeners, offering training opportunities, and making sure that members of the community can take part in how the station is run. Community stations typically provide 93 hours of original and distinctive output a week, mostly locally produced. On average, stations operate with 87 volunteers who together give around 209 hours of their time a week. And I would argue that in terms of content production, community radio is our biggest media sector, but I'm not counting social media in that. So, being a central part of your community, as Ofcom put it, offering training, making sure people can take part in how things run, this isn't cheap, easy, or straightforward. And doing all this whilst delivering a full-time schedule of original programmes on a very low budget is demanding work. Station managers can feel really overwhelmed by the demands of community radio, and they might reasonably ask, why is there so much pressure on us compared to other broadcasters? And they might want to generate more of their income from advertising, which is restricted in our licenses. They might also not always let their presenters know that they can have a say in how the station is run. That might be too much to cope with. And we often see station managers can be nostalgic for actually another type of radio, the independent, local, commercial radio of the 1970s and 80s, a form that you might define by playlisted popular music, adverts, news on the hour, and a narrow demographic of presenters. But this kind of local commercial radio has pretty much died out, as nearly all commercial licenses in the UK are now just run by two companies. And as Caroline was saying, it's actually the restrictions community radio works under, frustrating as they can be, such as being non-profit and one company only operating one station that protects what we do and allows it to continue. Will such restrictions remain in place though? The trend perhaps is more towards deregulation. As we see governments come and go, different values are enshrined in media law and in the working practices of the regulators themselves. For example, in the last year, Ofcom reduced the programming and training responsibilities of community radio stations, who of course were overstretched by the COVID crisis. But this was at a time when accountable local media was most needed. So instead of DCMS finding extra funds to support this good quality, accurate, accountable local media, they've effectively said, well, just do less of it, worse and cheaper. Similarly, our annual reporting to Ofcom was massively simplified in 2014, and we're now wondering, will it be dropped altogether? We're also seeing, as Caroline said, the emergence of small-scale DAB, which looks like a very light-touch version of community radio. Licenses much easier to obtain and to operate. And if we gradually see migration from FM and AM over to DAB, this would be a phasing out of community radio as it's defined in that original order of 2004. We've also seen in the last few years, Ofcom have begun to monitor broadcasters for the diversity of their workforce, which was long overdue. However, nearly all the community radio stations are exempt from this kind of reporting because we're considered to be too small to have to report this kind of data. And again, the message to us is, oh, well, we don't want to trouble you too much. You're already doing too much. However, that thinking doesn't apply to other Ofcom matters, such as handling a complaint, which is, of course, a thing that station managers really dread having to deal with. So I feel it's important for community radio to resist deregulation and instead recognise the vital protections our work needs to be able to continue. We need to communicate the value of what we do and its long history. But it may be that deregulation cannot be resisted. It may happen anyway. So what can we do instead? Well, looking at free radio around the world, many of the best examples have happened without any state permission or support in any way. But they demonstrate authentic democratic engagement where marginalised people have a voice, where broadcast infrastructure is in the hands of local people, and where accountability comes from those deep conversations, either live on air or on those shabby sofas in the room next to the studio, where people make eye contact, collaborate on media production, and care about one another. In late night live music sessions or mid-morning workshops, at fundraising parties and those all hands on deck cleaning and sorting out the studio days. In small communities, word gets around quickly. For example, if someone steals a piece of kit or behaves like a creep or bully or spreads misinformation on air. Media organisations that are genuinely inclusive have robust policies as well as friendly, welcoming studios and opportunities to learn from one another. So media accountability can and must be built into legislation, but it's only meaningful to do so when regulators care about our day-to-day media spaces and culture, where we can also hold one another to account. That's me done.
Again, thank you so much for that, Lucinda. And I think there's some really, there's some real questions at the moment about whether Ofcom is fit for purpose in terms of its ability to regulate the national broadcasters. And maybe in the discussion afterwards, we could think about what kind of other bodies maybe community media could invent for itself to do some more of that kind of horizontal accountability. Shemiza, should we come to you?
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Lucinda and Caroline, for your really thought out answers. And it's really made me think about my role in community media. For it's been now a decade I've been working on Inspire FM and also with Radio Lab as well. And I think the reason why I am passionate about community media in a particular community radio is exactly what it says on the tin. It is about representing the community, not talking at it, but talking to it. When we think about democracy and we think about democratic media, it needs to be including marginalized and diverse communities. And I don't really see that across the board when we talk about sort of the mainstream media. So this is where I feel a more love and passion for community media, in particular community radio, especially in the pandemic, where a community in Luton may have felt quite disconnected, but community radio was their lifeline because they didn't feel they could relate to the regional radio, but it was community radio that felt that spoke to them in a language that they understood. They didn't feel patronized, they didn't feel disconnected. They were able to have that support in a language that they understood, which was imperative. We were all struggling, we still are struggling in the pandemic, and to have a voice that you can actually understand and representative of you is it's so needed. So a decade on Inspire FM, and the reason why I continue to stay in community radio is because I feel, as a woman of Muslim heritage, and seeing the way Muslim stories were not being fully represented in a sort of a coherent way, but there was a lot more sensationalism, the rise of Islamophobia. It felt like Muslim radio stations like Inspire FM enabled the voices and narrative to be owned and to be shared and to be explored and to provide a safe space for the community to come together and actually have an opportunity for them to be heard where they may not be able to be heard elsewhere. So with this in mind, it really makes me value the spaces that we have. And if those spaces are taken away, then where else do communities or communities like this go to? Who can they turn to when already their stories have been misquoted and sensationalized? So for me, I just feel it is so important that there is more funding placed into community media. I think it's important that we understand and appreciate that, you know, it's not just, it's the lifeline, and to take away that from communities I think is detrimental. And I also feel that yes, the reason why community media might be successful is because they're not actually having to compete with anybody. They're not having to compete with commercial radio. There isn't that much pressure on them, so they're able to manage at a slower pace. And when you're actually creating and producing shows at a slower pace, there's more sort of, it's a lot more easier on the ears and a lot more easier to listen to and to connect with. And I think this is where the success of maybe some of my shows have been, because I felt that I'm not rushing my participants or the guests on my show, that they feel that this is a trustworthy space they can come to, that they can speak out, they can be themselves. And it would make me feel extremely nervous knowing that there weren't spaces like this available for diverse communities. It is managed by a lot of volunteers who are giving a lot of their time for free, and they do it from their heart, they do it from their soul. They're not just turning up for the sake of it. But the lack of investment does make it very difficult to keep the confidence, really, or to keep people to stay, because obviously everybody needs to earn an income, and they choose to then want to go on to other things. But there is, for me, I've stayed with Inspire FM for a good 10 years, and the reason why I do that, I think it's out of love. It really is out of love. I don't feel I'll be able to put my heart and soul anywhere else as much, because I just feel that I'm in control of what I'm projecting. I'm in control of the stories I'm able to to share. I'm in control of what I feel that my audience wants to listen to and what the audience wants to say. And having that control, or having that opportunity to be able to have a space where you can create without an agenda is just a wonderful space to be. But I think a lot of it is voluntary, and because there isn't that pressure of anybody at the top as such, I know that you've got to kind of follow all the rules and regulations in radio, and follow the Ofcom rules, but the fact that there isn't a hidden agenda there, it is for the community, makes it really quite exciting. So I think you can hear how passionate I am, and I hope I am making sense. I really value this space. I feel that it is extremely important that this space does get extra funding, that it encourages more people to kind of look into how it works, how the system works, and it really is for the community, spaces like this. And I have to say, it is a wonderful springboard as well for those that want to go into mainstream media to develop a career in mainstream media. I think it's a wonderful doorway in doing so. But then there is lots of people that may wish not to go into mainstream. How do you keep them in? How do you keep them in community radio? Yeah, so I think that's just all I'm really wanting to say, that I think it's a beautiful space. I think it needs to be respected, and be given more public funding support, but also enable it to have the control in actually serving its community in the best way that it can do.
Thank you so much for that, Shemaza. And I think I had a kind of follow-up question for you immediately, or in fact, all of you could come to this as well. You know, one of the themes we've had, Caroline, you talked about the community radio stations having to be democratically owned. And I immediately wrote down a thing of being like, is democratically owned the same as democratically run? And then Lucinda, you were saying, well, you know, sometimes the station managers don't always explain that everybody can have a say. And I guess I wondered, Shemaza, if you could talk from your own experience of like, what does it really mean in practice to have a democratically run community media space? What are some of the things that can sometimes be a bit tricky about that? And how different is that to a kind of more professionalized space?
I think it's about experience, and then the level of experience people have to bring into a space like, and being fully representative of all those individuals in that space in the radio station. Sometimes there are a lot of people that are coming in as volunteers. They're not professionally trained. So we want to keep the doors open for everybody, but not everybody has those skills, because the way the radio stations are managed, they are not professionally trained as such. It's more out of the love, and the training comes with practice. So even though we want to keep it open and we want everybody to have that opportunity, when we say being democratic, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because it is all down to how well equipped you are with the skills. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered that.
I think I'm having some internet problems.
We can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I'd answered that effectively. I think what I'm trying to say is, as much as
like
we
to
want
come in on that as well.
Sorry, Debs, we lost you a little bit there. Shall I continue from Shemaza? I mean, that was great what you're saying, Shemaza. I do think in terms of skills, there are a lot of really different skills. And obviously there's different skills for community media than for other media. But there's also other different types of skills that we need in our organisations. And we really emphasise skills like kindness and listening, above all listening. You know, it's a space for listening where you you develop these rich conversations in the studio. You might be using very simple technology, just pushing up a fader, chatting a bit, and then you're broadcasting out these ways of listening. So what we're always trying to develop here is our listening skills more than the technical skills, because technical is the kind of the boring bit compared to a rich way of listening to one another.
I think what is interesting in terms of managing community radio stations is that now the sector is more mature. We have some really good examples of well-managed stations and well-managed stations in times of enormous difficulty sometimes in terms of the prevailing funding context. And I think if you look at some of the really experienced managers, they do have, in community radio, they have a very wide range of skills. They often come from community development, youth work, social work, arts management, or they build up those skills. And I think although there are the radio aspects of management, whether it's resources, technical resources, compliance, and so on, actually the majority of the skills are to do with people, developing people, and developing people's creativity and enabling people to work in a station together. So I think we've now got quite a lot of experience. Some stations have been on air, including all the experiments when we weren't really allowed to broadcast very much. The people being on air, managed stations for a long time and have built up really consistent radio management practice. And some people in the community sector have been managing the stations for a lot longer than the sort of time that people would stay in a commercial or a BBC station, for instance.
I think that leads really nicely onto, I think there's something about sharing skills. And someone's asked, how would you go about setting up a radio station? But also a question about how can people find local community media stations? So what are the kind of avenues or spaces for people to enter into this world or, understand how it works?
Do you want me to start on that? I mean, the Community Media Association UK will tell you where the stations are. There's actually an interactive geolocated map on their website, and there's also a number of different toolkits and information about how to set a station up from scratch. But it's quite likely that there'll be a station already on air in your locality. So I would suggest that first of all, find out whether there is a station that represents either your locality or your interests, and get involved with that rather than reinventing the wheel. Because, and I suppose there are levels of setting up a station. You can set up an internet station, on your own, talking to yourself and maybe a few friends. But the formal license Ofcom stations on the whole, not all of them, are where to sort of go and have a look. So look on the Community Media Association website, and also I can say look on radio.garden and you can zoom in to any location and look at what's available there.
Yes, and I would say twiddle a dial on a radio and see what you find.
That's a good one. But also tap into your local universities. A lot of universities have their own radio station. I've been very lucky that Radio Lab at Bedford University have had me on for 3 years now, doing their shows promoting arts in the community, in particular women in arts. And that's just so exciting because I've actually learned a few more skills just, at university on a voluntary radio station there. And those skills are just so valuable. It really does broaden your horizons as well, and also tap into maybe your hospital. They'll have a radio station at your local hospital as well. And the great thing is, even in the pandemic, we haven't stopped, because I was doing all my radio shows via Zoom in my living room. So the fact the way technology has moved forward enables you to kind of, have airtime, airplay anywhere
And that's a really nice segue to, we've got a couple of questions asking about the future. So one asking about what should community media in the UK look like in 10, 20 and 30 years time? And someone else asking, how do we repurpose these principles of community media so that they are fit for purpose to deal with the future social, environmental and technical challenges and changes that we face? So what are all of your visions for community media? Lucinda, do you want to start?
Go on, I'll say a little bit. So one of my really big interests is in kind of analog media technologies, such as FM broadcasting. Obviously, it's not completely divorced from digital technologies, but and things like zine publishing as well, handmade, kind of tangible things where the actual infrastructure that you are publishing on can be community owned at a really direct level. And in some kind of dystopian nightmare, the internet could be removed, or our rights to it could be removed. We're also, a lot of us are very concerned by being tracked and traced or bullied on the internet in a way that radio still affords this kind of actual space that we have more control of, actually. We're more private. Nobody really knows where we are or who we are. We don't know who's listening. They can switch off. We're not personally offended. And that gives us a lot of creative freedom as artists or as, citizen journalists, whatever. And I'm really interested in how we keep those kind of technologies and the knowledge of them alive in our communities. I was interesting a few years ago when we were at a big radio festival in Germany. They were saying there was a big resurgence in ham radio in Germany from younger generations who were like, oh, this is cool. We want to learn this. We don't want to rely just on the internet. And I think we'll see the same thing here in the way that, there are no obsolete media. Vinyl records kind of came back massively as a response to MP3. And I think we're starting to see that with radio as one of these rather really exciting technologies that actually we can get our hands on. We can build it ourselves. We can run it on a wind turbine or a solar panel, our own transmitters that we actually own and control ourselves. So I'm really interested in how those technologies will thrive and also be reinvented. Because if there's things that podcasting or digital are doing that analog radio doesn't need to do anymore because it's gone elsewhere, it's up to us now to kind of reinvent what that might be going forwards.
Brilliant. Caroline?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear that slightly dystopian technological sort of future. And I have told many of my students at University of Sunderland, and we also have a community radio station called Spark there. I've actually said to them that, if the internet goes, radio will be the last person standing, and they look at me in horror. But I think with a slightly more utopian view, and actually our station in the early days was called Radio Utopia, and it was set up originally as part of a festival in the Northeast called the Visions of Utopia Festival, and we worked with arts and community organisations across the Northeast to be the radio station for that, and that was how one of the sort of ways that we started involving people in community radio in Sunderland and the Northeast. I think what I would like to see, the best community stations are the ones that are like community media hubs in their communities, and they're people who go there rather like Shamiza was talking about. They're there because of their interests and their expertise. And so they're plugged in to the arts community, the youth community, the different, the health and well-being communities, and they're seen as a resource and an accessible resource and a place of conversation. In reality, people involved in community radio are often really busy in other areas of their lives. And I think one of the problems with community radio and the voluntary nature of it, it's not it's not a problem that's specific to community radio. It's a problem in any voluntary organisation. And I think, unfortunately, there has been a sustained sort of underfunding of the voluntary sector. And that means the voluntary sector is up against the wall and is disempowered because people are just so busy surviving. And I think the worry is that the community radio station or community media project itself becomes so pressured that people are just coming in to do their shifts and they're not really talking to each other in the way that, I mean, I know from visiting Soundart Radio, there was a wonderful communal and convivial atmosphere there. And so I think I'd like to see stations that are really part of hubs at different levels. I'd actually like to see the metropolitan mayors taking on community radio, actually. I think that there's been some really interesting developments at that level. I think on the whole, MPs, although they willingly come and do their bit on community radio, they don't really stand up for community radio. Apart from the odd one, they don't really integrate community radio into all the different departments. So I think the metropolitan mayors, especially with some of their budgets, they would, I think, a lobbying of them to see the benefit, particularly around social justice and supporting a whole range of different groups and campaigns. So I'd like to see that. So well-funded community hubs that people want to go to. And one of the great things about Soundart Radio is you go in and you don't really know you're in a radio station. In fact, I once almost forgot I was on the radio station because it was so homely and so it was such a good space to be in. You're right. I think the during the pandemic, that's been really interesting because actually the normal business of community radio has it's changed. People can't just walk in and out of buildings, the station, but what it has done is empowered people and shown that any broadcaster now is working from home. Any broadcaster is being interrupted by cats and children. Any broadcaster is, and I think, although I don't want to see a community sector that's powered by individuals in their box, they're in their bedrooms necessarily. I think in the same way that when digital technology started and people were able to edit in their homes, I can remember working in Bradford. And the women I was working with Bradford Community Broadcasting, suddenly they didn't have to find time in their lives to come to the station, but they could they could edit their pieces and record their pieces at home late at night or whatever, and it fitted it more in with their lifestyle. So I think that there are changes enabled by technology and remote broadcasting that enable more people to have access. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Fantastic. And Shemiza, tell us your vision. What do you think the future of community media would look like ideally?
Okay, wherever there's going to be community, there will always be community media. I mean, I want to come back to what Caroline had said about in the pandemic, we were all kind of on a level playing field, really, weren't we? With mainstream broadcasters and community broadcasters all broadcasting from their living rooms or their bedrooms. And I think the way technology is evolving and the way we've been able to kind of work through our roles in the pandemic has been really eye-opening. The fact is having that control to kind of adapt and innovate and be innovative in using technology. As long as technology is there, I think there's always going to be an opportunity to kind of share our voices, but being democratic and allowing those voices to be shared is something that I hope we will always continue to have, because if we don't, then that would really worry me. As long as we have that, then every voice has the right to be amplified.
I suppose I have a question which is about exploring a bit more about this relationship between community media and the BBC. Caroline, you talked about some of the things that the BBC has tried to do, has maybe not done so well. I'm interested to know about your experiences of this, and what do you think the barriers are within the BBC to having a more constructive relationship with community media? And if you have had more positive experiences of that relationship, what has that looked like and felt like? What of their own practice should be replicated? What does a good relationship between the BBC and community media look and feel like? Caroline, do you want to start?
Yeah. I feel bad. I was critical of the BBC, and they don't have a right of reply on this panel. And there are some fantastic producers and managers at the BBC who I've worked with on a number of community initiatives. I think the problem is consistency, and there are lots of one-off things that have been done really well, but they can stop in an instant, and depending on priorities, and I think or depending on who is in a particular job in a particular station or managing at a particular level at the BBC. And I think I would like to see more collaboration, but I would also like to see a bit more respect. I think, unfortunately, the community sector is seen as the lesser, and I think what I've been trying to do, and I think we've all been trying to do in this panel, is say that the community sector has got a massive amount of talent and experience and connection with communities, and that needs to be valued. That really needs to be valued, so that we're not just doing the BBC a favour, when we're sort of opening the door into the kind of connections that we've got and the talent we've got. And I'm afraid, because the BBC is such a large organisation, the kind of connectivity between community radio and the BBC, gets a bit lost. And I'd like to see more consistency, more acknowledgement through proper funding and staffing. There's plenty of good ideas, and obviously community radio is a huge training ground for the BBC and commercial radio, and because many universities and stations, that have media courses, radio courses, are training people, and then they can choose to go into different sectors. But there seems to be a sort of disconnect around respect and funding and sort of status, and inevitably the BBC is sort of doing some of the things that community radio are doing, but they are different, and I think there needs to be more respect of those differences.
And Shamiza, you've done presenting with BBC Three Counties, is that right?
Yes.
Do you have reflections on what the differences have been and what that relationship has been?
It's been wonderful working with BBC Three Counties as a cover presenter and a panelist with them for a good number of years. And I do see the difference between community radio and BBC radio, and the fact that there is a lot more investment in getting producers to produce content, and whereas like on community radio we're on our own, we produce, we present, we have to do it all on our own. So it's been quite an interesting learning curve for me, and it has kind of enhanced my skill set as a radio presenter too. What I find fascinating about mainstream radio or BBC radio is the fact that I am observed in the work that I do, because I'm touching base with individuals that are not on their radar. So when I'm interviewing guests or when I'm producing my shows, it is watched, as in on Twitter. My work is being tweeted out, and then I have guests that will ring me up and say, oh, by the way, I've been approached by BBC at so-and-so or BBC elsewhere, apart from BBC Three Counties, inviting me on as a guest because I've been seen on your radio show, I've been heard on your radio show, which is wonderful. I think it's absolutely fantastic that I'm able to empower these wonderful individuals who are from like the Muslim community to be heard on a different platform. But I think one thing that in one instance it's absolutely wonderful, but then I think, well, I'm not really being paid for this research that I'm providing for yourselves. I'm having to do all this hard work on my own, but you guys are getting paid a lot more. But then it just shows that I'm actually in touch with my community or the wider community. They're willing to kind of be a guest on my show out of trust. And so when I'm handing over these guests, or these guests are going on to the mainstream, and they're only like on for a little bit of time, like just 10 minutes, that's a bit of a culture shock for them. Well, you gave us 15 or an hour to speak. I only got 5 minutes. I'm like, that's the reality of it. That's the difference between community radio and mainstream radio, or the BBC. Community radio, we take our time. It's a relaxed environment. We're actually speaking to you, not at you. I'm not saying that BBC do that, but it is a completely different. It's you're in and out. You're in and out. But I appreciate the collaboration that we have with BBC Three Counties, because they do provide that additional platform for the guests. They want to stay connected with the community of Luton. They want to know who would be a great guest. So they kind of keep an eye on the work that I'm doing. So the collaboration is there. But I really appreciate what Caroline has said as well about that being patronized. We are looked down upon in community radio, even though we do we create work, we create opportunities through our shows for guests to move on to better things, hopefully. But as community presenters, I think we're looked down upon a little bit, and we are patronized slightly, maybe. So yeah, that kind of, I kind of could relate to what Caroline had said there, but I actually value the platform that I have, because I do see it's making a massive big difference, empowering those voices to have their narrative shared in a safe space.
Great. And Lucinda, any quick thoughts on that?
On BBC, yeah, I mean, like Caroline, it's hard to kind of say something negative when we're all very one-sided, but I might say something slightly negative now, which is I do feel, as particularly as an artist working with the stuff of radio, that there can be very low creative risk at BBC, and having made various bits and pieces over the years and done these sort of community radio BBC collaborations, sometimes it's quite, we're sort of told, oh no, you see, that's not how it's done. No, that isn't how we're making radio. No, it's done like this. And we'll be told like the ideas that are in fashion at that time. And then we'll see kind of ideas come into fashion and sort of be understood, and like, oh now everybody's doing field recordings. We're going to call it slow radio, and so things that we might have been doing for years and years, and be told like, oh no, you're getting it wrong. That's not how you make proper radio. Then they come into fashion, and that can be frustrating. I think a little bit echoing Shamai's experience, you can feel a little bit mined for your ideas rather than given a space to broadcast your own stuff. You see them taken up, so ideas, formats, even names of programs sometimes, and a copy of them taken up from like were developed in community media, taken up in BBC or in other big media like that. So that can be a little bit of a problem, I think, for innovative radio. And we see community radio as a space where innovation can happen, because we're not about mass audience. We're about the experience of taking part and making together. So new kinds of media forms and formats are kind of emerging, and there's that initial resistance, and then that sort of mining process. So that's a frustration for me, I think.
Okay, so we're sort of coming to the end. We don't really have time to address these questions, but I just wanted to raise some of the things that have been said in the chat across different platforms. So one was talking about the possibility of community radio stations not running commercial advertising, but government advertising and messaging, and that could be a way that kind of new funds are channeled. people asking whether you're concerned about the number of SSDAB applications by commercial national groups. I don't know even enough about this to know what SSDAB means.
Small scale DAB.
Small scale.
Small scale DAB, okay. And so also a question about Ofcom and whether it needs more powers to enforce this idea of social gain, and whether community radio should be accepted officially as public service broadcasting, and also a question about how women can be empowered to be in positions of leadership in community radio organisations. So I guess I just wanted to pass over to each of you for some final comments and reflections, and you can bring in responses to any of those things if you want to. But I also particularly want to ask you, we're trying to create this manifesto for a people's media. I think you've all mentioned things that could potentially go in that manifesto, but maybe if there was just, one or two, your kind of headline things that would go in there for either for community media itself as a sector, or for the BBC or other national broadcasters. What's your policy that you would like to champion the most? Maybe let's start with Lucinda.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'd say a couple of those points raised from the questions about government messaging and public service broadcasting. I'd be very wary of those ideas. I think independence and our accountability to our very local community is the key thing. And I'm not saying that either of those things are absolutely wrong, but I'd be very cautious about feeling too tied to government messaging or the concept of public service broadcasting, which is really about this talking at rather than creating with models. So I personally don't define what we do as public service broadcasting. I'm just going to move to some of my things that I think are manifesto worthy. It's knowing your history, knowing media history, and knowing that the materiality of the forms that you're working with, whether they're electromagnetic spectrum or paper, and the effects that those have on these media power relationships is really, really important. And, the culture that we come out of and how that's arisen and how we can take that forward. And my other thing I would say to everybody is do take part and do get involved and do have fun. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Shamiza, you want to come in?
I think the emphasis on women and giving them a greater platform to share their stories and share their viewpoints as producers, as technicians, as broadcasters. I think there was a question that was posed about how can women be more effective in broadcasting. I think from my experience, I was one of the very few Muslim female broadcasters in community radio, Muslim community radio. And 10 years on, I'm still seeing a very handful of women coming through, but it's actually inspired them because they've seen me doing it for such a long time. So I think a manifesto that kind of really champions the role of women in their communities to kind of deliver their stories and issues that matter to them would be very well received, I think. And power to us.
Brilliant. And Caroline?
Well, following on from that, nearly 30 years ago, FemFM was a short-term community station in Bristol, and we had 200 women involved in that. And we've seen the sort of ripples of effect from that for over the last 30 years. And next year is the 30th anniversary, and we're actually tracing what some of the women involved in that did, and they are still talking about how positive having a radio station of women was to them in validating their voices themselves, and seeing women doing almost every single job in a radio station. So having those role models and increasingly now mentorships, I think, is really important. And I think what community stations do is enable people to see people doing work in different roles, and having the opportunity to grow into those roles and take those on. And I think there are some excellent female leaders in community radio, and maybe we need to make more of them, you make more fuss about them. Some of the other questions, I think there really is an issue around DAB and these new small scale DABs. Of course, community radio stations want to be on the DAB platforms because increasingly people are listening to radio on DAB, and I think I think there is a danger that the licenses, if they're given to new community stations, that they won't have the same kind of protection on that DAB platform as with their own licenses. So I think there's something that really needs to be looked at there. Yeah, I think with funding, as I said before, I think we need to. I think someone said in the questions that the audio production fund, which is a fantastic way of funding producers and programs, but that money isn't coming into the community radio stations. And I actually think we need to look at ways that some of that money can come to the stations, because it's the stations developing the methodologies for involving the communities. It's not just an individual producer. It's all about the kind of what is underneath that. And I think that there needs to be discussion about that distinctiveness of the way that community radio programs happen, so that there can be funding for that kind of thing. And certainly in some other countries that happens. I do think we also need to look at international models of community radio regulation and finance.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you all so much for contributing and being on the panel today. I also want to congratulate us all, because we got through this entire event without any of us speaking while being on mute, which is a miracle. Yeah, thank you to everyone thank you to the panelists, thank you to everyone for watching. Please keep an eye out for other events being organised as part of the BBC and Beyond campaign. As I said at the start, we've got another one tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. on protest, media and dissent. Details of everything is on Media Reform Coalition social media. And please do contribute to the manifesto if you have ideas. You go to BBC and beyond.net/manifesto. The link will be on the final slide. Good evening, and thank you so much for attending.